We'll take a few questions, and then we'll answer and then take some more. Go ahead.
I'm Russ Vernon-Jones. I'm a local climate activist. And I want to thank the panel for these outstanding presentations and for the way you've centered the nature of the climate emergency and some significant answers. 2 weeks ago, I was at a meeting in DC that the Institute for Policy Studies, that John Pfeffer and some others pulled together, with a number of people from the Global South who had been engaged with the IMF and World Bank over time. And every single one of them advocated keeping international climate finance away from the IMF and the World Bank. So my questions are for the panel, but also really for everyone here. Starting immediately, humanity needs to move trillions of dollars from the global north to the global south. And as it was mentioned yesterday, we're going to need to deal with loss and damage and adaptation before global south nations are able or willing to deal with mitigation. But we urgently need them to deal with mitigation right away. By 2030, 50% of all greenhouse gas emissions are going to be from the developing nations, and that's not including China. So my questions are, how are these trillions going to be accessed or created, and what forms will they take? What institutions or mechanisms must we create so that these funds are kept out of the hands of the IMF and other institutions that have an 80-year history of preserving and expanding neocolonialism? And to whom are these funds going to go in the Global South, given the governmental corruption and the lack of experience in some of the nations of the Global South? Yet we need the Global South to really have power and control over how the funds are used. Now, as Rama was saying at the end, you can say these things are impossible, that they can't happen, and that may be true, but given that climate change is accelerating, they must happen. And our failure to do these things will result in much of the planet being unsustainable for life and countless deaths. And in the face of that, I think we have to try. So my last question is, how do we engage even more of the people in your field and your colleagues in answering these and similar questions directly? Thank you.
Ahilan Kalgama from the University of Jaffna in Sri Lanka. So I'm trying to connect what we've been talking the last 2 days to this panel, which has been really thought-provoking. So if you kind of look at, with all these debt restructuring process, one of the big demands is obviously to increase the primary budget surplus, which also comes with market pricing energy, right? Because of the subsidies. Now, when we look at it that way now, if you look at historically, I mean, I'm much more aware of what's going on in Sri Lanka. When you get rid of the subsidies and you do a cash transfer, which is also part of the IMF programs now, is to go towards targeted cash transfers or some kind of cash transfer, then of course, over time, it's inflated away. So the subsidy then is suddenly reduced over time. That's one issue. So how do we deal with that practically in terms of implementing what Robert was talking about? And the second thing is, for a lot of these livelihoods and so on, if you're looking at it in terms of the impact on livelihoods, the shocks have a huge impact, right? So even if you could see from Robert's graphs about the fluctuations, and then, so how do you smooth out the prices? And so suddenly the state is withdrawing from that role of having, so, in Sri Lanka now, every month we change the price of fuel. And then, so if there's a shock, then that's all absorbed at the household level and so on. The third point is, can we disaggregate, like, when you're talking about fossil fuels? So for example, if you take our rural economy, it's fisherfolk farmers, they use kerosene oil, right? So why not subsidies for kerosene oil and not, or offer public transport, or so instead of, so can we disaggregate it and then have a strategy of thinking about subsidies? Thank you.
Thank you very much for very interesting presentations. And I would like to do a question to Robert, an explanation really. And it is an issue, an added issue to what you were explaining, and it's the issue of timing. So what we have seen looking at many IMF programs is that when you remove a subsidy, this can be done overnight. You go to the Ministry of Finance and suddenly cut it. And the problem is the compensation, which is a tiny, small, insufficient safety net. They order it to happen, but implementing a safety net takes years to happen. So what you have is really a very negative social impact. And going to the explanation that Dotsie did yesterday on Ghana, adding to that, in Ghana, the fuel subsidy was about 12 billion. And the interesting thing, it was cut immediately, and then it was a safety net of 20 million that took years to develop. Happened overnight, very small. And then the question is, where did all the money go? You know, the compensation is so insufficient, the counting what it was there in the system, and we should somehow monitor where do these fiscal savings go. They should go for sustainable development, to, you know, for distribution issues, to fight climate change, but not simply they disappear, you know, in you know, to support, you know, debt and others, their repayments and all that. And from team, I liked many things what you said, but I found very interesting what you were mentioning about a kind of a global class of, you know, it will be important to expose more about the you know, these national polluting classes and the interconnections they have globally. And I think that exposure, you know, will be important for change in the future. Thank you.
Could we, why don't we let the panelists answer some of those questions? Rama, do you want to start? You want to collect more? Okay. Just a lot of questions. Okay.
I think we had on.
We have one in the back, actually.
That one? Yeah, thanks. Hi, my name's Emma. I also have a question for Robert on the same lines. Because, yeah, we've had a lot of fights, some of us, with the fund on the way they do the subsidy, the recommendations on subsidy cuts. And I worry, right, that they basically take away sort of the first 10% of your message, right, that these subsidies, you know, benefit the rich. We hear that a lot, but then when it comes to that implementation on things like the timing, they have nothing to say, and so that's where we see, you know, the way in which these are implemented having these really harmful effects, as Isabel also just said. So I've been wondering. I think maybe a human rights framing could help with strengthening some of that latter part of your work, because, you know, I'm not saying a human rights framing will help land this with folks like the IMF, but maybe for some governments it could be useful, because if you think about it, you know, what human rights law requires, non-retrogression, if there is retrogression, for it to be temporary, and then even in those cases, you know, you need real redress that actually goes to the people who are affected, and in a way that these incredibly targeted social protection measures can never do, right? And so, because they're so imprecise. And so, you know, maybe talking about that distributional impact in terms of legally binding human rights obligations might be a useful way to sort of strengthen the need for taking that part seriously, right? So thanks.
Hi, I'm Ahmet Tonak, UMass as well as Smith College. I have a couple of questions to Bob. I wonder whether you check the concentration of these subsidies, I mean, throughout the countries. I wonder whether they are concentrated in certain type of countries, but another type of countries? And that's first. The second question is in terms of income effect of these subsidies, what kind of income that we use, I think matters, whether post-tax, before tax, or even post-expenditures. I mean, you may have negative impact vis-a-vis distributing negative impact of subsidies to different income groups, but at the same time, in different countries, you may have some compensating public expenditure policies, even your tax policies, may deal with that actual negative impact. I think that would be an interesting exercise. And thirdly, although you gave us high coefficients vis-a-vis jump 2020 on in terms of GDP percentage of subsidies globally, but we know that 2020 was a very unusual year in terms of global GDP growth. It was, I think, negative something, negative 3%. So I mean, so that's the point I would like to make. And the last two speakers, I mean, if you address yourself to the question of political actors, and if you have some sort of optimism in terms of your either explicit or implicit suggestions that the policies that we should follow, I mean, you have some sort of time framework and institutions through which these policy changes that you are proposing may be done.
Thank you. I have just 3 comments for Rama's proposal for the financial architecture. The first one is issue of scale. If you look at all the facilities, the institutions, from the Resilience Trust Fund, SDRs, World Bank, really the mobilization finance is nothing. The Resilience Trust Fund has mobilized effectively only 7 billion. SDRs for Africa were in August 2021 with the issue were 30 billion, 55 billion for Latin America, that's nothing. World Bank lending to Latin America is about 15 billion. It's really very little. The other comment that I have, and the IMF, the financing facilities, the calculations I did for financing facilities for short term during the pandemic, they covered about 30% only of the financing needs. It must be also inclusive. In most of the initiatives that you mentioned from the of lending, concessional lending, DSSI, the G20 framework, other facilities, the Poverty Reduction Trust Fund, they include low-income countries, lower middle-income countries, and upper middle-income countries that are considered vulnerable. But a lot of upper middle-income countries that need the money, for example, Caribbean countries, are left out. Finally, I think it's important to be realistic. National development banks are not going to mobilize climate finance. Basically, their mandate is for financial inclusion, to overcome asymmetric imperfections in financial markets and lend to SMEs. And the only banks, actually, development banks that do climate finance are either multilateral development banks or regional development banks. Thank you.
Hello, Devamanyu from UMass, graduate student. I have actually a question for all of the panelists. This was such interesting as a panel. For Bob, I was wondering about when we are talking about transitioning from fossil fuel subsidies, it seems that there is going to be some sort of resistance from the vested interest groups in Indonesia or in India or wherever this kind of transition is happening. So what are some of those comparative experiences and how to win over those? So that's more like a political economy question. The question for Tim was with respect to African Green Hydrogen Alliance, which you mentioned. That seems like a an example of South-South cooperation to me. So if you could talk a little bit about the institutional changes in that framework and what is the share of public versus private contribution there in that kind of a South-South cooperation. That is something I'm interested in. For Rama, it's the summary about how the problems actually lies in this nature of finance that is great. When it comes to solution, when we are talking about industrial policies for the global south, the basic strategies, as from what I understood, was the onus was lying on the state and on the central bank and on all these multilateral development banks, right? But it's also about a strategic cooperation with the multinational corporations. That is also industrial policy, and that is how industrial policy is very different in the 21st century when we are talking about the green transition. So where does this private finance actually, and this sector, that enters your framework that I'm interested? Thank you.
One and then two.
And then we'll let them answer the several questions.
Thanks. This is a great panel, and I'm glad this political economy came up. Is this okay? Okay. So yeah, I'm glad this question of political economy came up, because sometimes there are things that are different, and have to be taken into account in terms of power, for example. And so the SDRs, I think, are a good example of that. I mean, this is something that's completely opposite of what the IMF has done for most of the last 80 years. It's hundreds of billions of dollars worth of assets that can be converted to hard currency, and therefore are reserves just as good as treasuries, okay? They make a huge difference in the world. It's 1%, by the way, of the global, of the GDP of developing countries, which is large. It's 10 times the climate finance that was approved in 2021. It can be approved every year, and it costs the rich countries nothing at all. Okay, so that's why, one of the reasons it was possible to do this in the United States, and that's unfortunate that it's the US Treasury that controls it all. But I think it's important to take into account that these are things that, we have to have an open mind on where some of these things will come from. They could come from unexpected sources. Thank you.
Hey, great panel. Comment for Bob's great paper. Given the fact that we're dealing with energy here, we have to be careful about looking at energy subsidy reduction in a vacuum, because the distributional impacts are not just income, but there's distributional impacts with respect to energy access, right? If you get rid of the subsidies, you have to make sure that folks have access to what they need, and at the bottom end of the income distribution, often the energy subsidies are for fuel to feed the family. And in this new green shock therapy that the IMF has, they didn't go to producer subsidies. And in Ecuador, they outlawed all consumer subsidies, and folks lost their fuel, and there were riots. It was like a yellow vest movement all over Ecuador against climate change and against these policies, because folks just didn't have any ability to be able to burn it, and so to be able to feed their families, and so they literally had to move the capital from Quito to Guayaquil because of the protests against that particular policy. So the design is important, and it's not just income transfer. If you can't take the new income and buy energy, then you've got a big problem. And then on the upper end of the distribution, if you go to the producer subsidies, right? If Ecuador got rid of all of its producer subsidies in one day, that is 40% of all of the government revenue, and it's their only source of foreign exchange. And so there's corresponding investments outside of income transfers that are necessary that can be large, and we have to grapple with that.
Okay. Who wants? I just will read out the Jomo question. Okay, sorry.
Sorry, this is a question from Jomo online. Thank you very much for excellent presentations, reminding us of the challenges of a global Green New Deal. When the UN proposed it, most renewable technology was in the West. It was envisaged that the West would lead in producing these, allowing the South to continue to electrify, industrialize, and develop. But with China and the South producing most of the means to generate such renewables, what can a contemporary global New Deal offer to the North and West? What does the panel suggest as the basis for contemporary multilateral green cooperation? After all, green used to be about both peace and sustainability.
That was a lot of questions and kind of some really deep things which are which require a lot more than the 5 minutes I have. Or 2 minutes? 3 minutes? What? Anyway, yeah. So I'm not going to go in order. I mean, the problem, as I had identified, had to do with the structure of global finance. And global finance doesn't mean that finance is independent of other, non-financial corporate interests and other kind of class and power interests. It's embedded in that. But as I see it, it's impossible to kind of coax private finance to change course. Just as it's difficult to make corporate capital change course from its nature-depleting, labor-saving bias. So the need for intervention comes from the need to go against the grain. But we're also talking about going against the grain while still being restricted by these same social relations. So it is in that context that the idea was to begin nationally, and by nationally I don't just mean central banks and, I talked about it, but central banks and credit policy, but the idea of a green program or a green inclusive program which has developed from below, and has buy-in and within the country, not just from the elite, but from the people, which is inclusive. Building on that, you build on regional, Esteban talked about the limits of the national development banks and the way they're working, yes. So what we're talking about is what they have the capacity to be. Because national development banks do not work the way private commercial banks or asset management funds work. There's been a change of rules, for example, in India, making them kind of conform more and more to market rules, but that doesn't have to be so. So if we can change them to be inclusive, we can also change them to be green. And in that sense, they become the basis for a pushback against the short-term logic of private finance. And that's how you build up. And from there, you build up to regional cooperation. Because, again, and the point which you made was that you can't depend on the IMF and the World Bank. Yes, and you can't depend on the scale is too small. Its direction is kind of not what the Global South needs. So in that sense, the push comes from then these regional cooperations, and you could also think of, cooperations across NDBs. You have the finance in common kind of thing, which I think is a better way to go than either the JETPs led by the IPG group or, the GFANS alliance. Those alliances don't work, but here you have a possibility of pushing back. And on SDRs, of course, there are limits. We've been talking about the issuing more, but I don't, it's not going to upend global dollar hegemony, but it's what you use to kind of expand space. And its role is really important in that way because you have debt problems, but you also have liquidity problems. And quite often those problems become debt problems, especially for middle income countries. So we need to address that. And again, going back to the question of the lack of experience in the Global South. Technology comes from, we have enough, idea of the old Green New Deal was that technology would come from the West and expertise would come from the West, and you have these plans and they're training. But I mean, my push is that let it come organically and let it come through cooperation within the South. And there are, I mean, at least with solar photovoltaic cells, we've seen that it doesn't have to be the West which leads. So, and I think that's the way to go and push. But I haven't covered all, but you can't.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for all the great comments, questions on your very broad issue of where do we mobilize against neocolonialism. I want to just be clear that, you know, in advocating for transitioning fossil fuel subsidies into alternative subsidies and using the funding to finance a Green New Deal, it's only one tool. I'm not saying that this is the tool. And in fact, I mean, I don't want to be too self-referential here, but I mean, I have actually developed a lot of different policy proposals, and I'll just mention one because it's very much along the lines of what you were talking about and other people have talked about in terms of green bond financing and using the capacity of central banks and connecting central banks with development banks to generate funds through the mechanism of development banks. And just as a couple of small exercises, during the 2007-2009 crisis and the immediate years after, the Federal Reserve bought anything on Wall Street to preserve the financial system to the tune of $12 trillion. So the money's there. The central banks of the major economies, I'm not a proponent of modern money theory, but I recognize there is a lot of truth in the idea that debt monetization by central banks gives them massive amount of flexibility to inject financial resources into an economy. In fact, Janet Yellen actually came here to UMass when she was chair of the Fed, and I had lunch with her, and I said, hey, can the Fed do green bond financing? Along the lines that you decide you're going to buy junk bonds, you're going to buy real estate to bail out Wall Street, could you do it? Is there any legal barrier to you doing that? And her answer was no. She said, we can do any of those things. We just don't because we haven't. So the idea that, I mean, the resources are certainly available. And then certainly, yeah, again, during the COVID crisis, in less than 1 year, the Fed purchased $4 trillion of assets on Wall Street, like that. So it's not like these funds couldn't be used to buy green bonds issued by development banks. And, you know, a lot of people have done good work on the role of development banks in green financing. Ocampo and Griffith-Jones have a couple of really good papers that have, I think, have been very valuable. And, you know, and also in order to transition the financial architecture away from fossil fuels, it can't just be a financial framework, but we also need a regulatory framework. A regulatory framework that says you can't burn fossil fuels. So you know, we can talk about the renewable energy portfolio standards, which basically just say, you know, you can only burn so much fossil fuels. And what about just saying you can only, utilities, you can only burn so much fossil fuels or your CEO goes to jail? That would actually get attention. So building that kind of framework, including a whole range of policy tools, I think are the ways through which we can make the green transition actively more effective. Now, on the critically important issue that you both raised with respect to timing, yes, we know that, yeah, it's easy to get rid of the fossil fuel subsidies, and it, has this massive negative impact on the lives of low-income people. As I said, if it's 5.5% of everybody's income, you take away 5.5% of rich people's income, okay, well then they're going to postpone their vacation maybe for a few months. But if it's 5% of low-income people's income, that means they're going to have to choose between food and electricity. So those issues have to be front and center, absolutely. And there is useful work on this. We do review in the paper the experience in India, which I won't go into, but the issues with the subsidies for the LPG subsidies, liquid petroleum gas subsidies, which is actually, at least according to the papers I've read, is now the largest low-income subsidy program in the world. And the program was introduced in 2013 and was actually recognized as facing these problems that you talked about in terms of timing and in terms of the capacity of low-income people to actually get the subsidy, and then also the fact that a high percentage of the rural people don't use kerosene to begin with. And so they're not benefiting from the lowest income people aren't benefiting because they're still burning wood. So all of these things definitely need to be taken into account. And when we talk about timing, those issues obviously have to be integrated. In terms of concentration of subsidies by country, well, yes, that's a great question, and I don't know the answer because we just finished this part of the paper. So, we only are asked to look at 2 countries and the world, and that's what we've got so far. But it wouldn't be very hard to, now that, it took a long time to sort out exactly what numbers we actually even trust in terms of these subsidies. And I was telling some people, maybe even you, that one experience I had just like a month ago, the institute that puts out the fossil fuel subsidy tracker numbers, which I think are pretty good, IISD, International Institute for Sustainable Development. They have a study for India that they came out within the last year. Correct me if I'm wrong, Shovik. And the number that they have in that particular study on fossil fuel subsidies in India is different than the number that they have actually online on the fossil fuel subsidy tracker, and not by a small amount. And so I wrote to them, I asked them what gives, and they say, we don't know. So these are, and I'm sure they're trying to be as scrupulous as possible. The measurement issues are actually very challenging. On the question of 2020, and was that did it jump because of the low GDP? Actually, no, 2020, it went down because the fossil fuel price went down. The jump was in 2020. Basically, everything follows, so far, everything follows fluctuations in the oil price, which suggests that whatever measures have been taken to reform or phase out fossil fuel subsidies have had no impact. I don't want to say zero, but largely because the movement of fossil fuel subsidies follows the movement of the global oil price. Yeah, so, I guess, on energy, renewable technology and the cost, I would just say, the single greatest achievement to date in terms of transitioning to a renewable energy infrastructure has been China's capacity to drive down the price of solar. The price of solar has come down 90% in 12 years. Unbelievable achievement. And yeah, as Jomo mentioned yesterday, yeah, Janet Yellen gave us, she went to China, she said, how dare they lower the price of fossil fuels, of renewable energy? Well, I mean, this is an issue. I mean, they've driven it down, and yes, their electric vehicles are also now, coming out affordable. Meanwhile, the U.S. has now got the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a subsidy program for, not entirely, but for renewable energy investments. How we sort out, these trade issues is beyond where I'm going to go today, but that obviously is a major question when we talk about trade competition.
Do we have a couple of minutes? All right, so I'll just handle the two questions from Jomo on strategic technology transfers. And I think he's absolutely right that we are no longer in a world where you just have downhill north to south transfers. You have uphill south to north transfers and lateral south to south transfers. In fact, I'm just finishing up a paper that should be out next month on precisely this issue. And we're looking through 6 case studies of 2 examples of each of those, north, south, south, south. And a really good example of the Chinese sort of technological dominance developed over the last 20, 30 years through, 5-year plans and putting a lot of scientists and engineers onto shop floors to learn from the best and then innovate. So it's not just imitation, it's innovation. And now we are 15, 20 years into that. So they've developed at this point, a lot of different battery chemistries, one of which is the iron phosphate battery, which is much, much cheaper because iron is the most plentiful element in the Earth's crust. And they've been making them for the last 5 odd years, and every car company wants to make them, because if you learn how to absorb and make that technology yourself, then your cars are going to be 30-50% cheaper and better and so on. So in the US, Ford wants to do a joint venture with them, started a factory in Michigan, but it is under pressure from the Republicans. How dare you take, advanced Chinese technology, and how dare American taxpayer money go to China? And this sort of works against there's the political logic there, but the firm wants the technology. So the firm is very interested in doing catch-up growth, and the classic example of every single developing country doing catch-up growth, which is you borrow from the best, you get them to your country, and then you absorb that know-how. It takes 10, 15 years, and then you outcompete them, or at least compete with them. So it's a really interesting case where lots of rich advanced countries will be looking in a very opportunistic way to look for technology, and I think that makes total sense. South-South transfers is South Africa looking for a market for sustainable aviation fuel in Europe. Europe has a mandate that they want to green jet fuel. South Africa has the technology. Why does South Africa have the technology? Well, they were under sanctions in the apartheid era, and under those sanctions, they learned how to liquefy coal and turn coal into oil. So this is a messy, messy world that we live in. And now, all of a sudden, South Africa has some of the largest liquefaction capacities in the world, technologies in the world, and they're willing to do a commercial deal with the Germans and the Europeans. So this is going to go all sorts of ways, and I think this is exactly how it should be. And in an ideal world, we would be trying to make frictionless technology transfer happen, but in the world that we are in, it's happening through joint ventures, which has been the traditional way this has happened. And then on the question of can we mark polluters and send them to jail, we have a lot of lawyers at The Hague that work on precisely these campaigns. Almost every country's political campaign names and shames villains. Michael Ash here at UMass has a fantastic list of the toxic 100 companies across the country, and each of those are being fined, for all the pollution that they do. The IRA actually has one of the few reinstating the Superfund tax to tax polluters. So this is a huge victory where we won it after it had been taken away by the polluters. So I'm pretty proud of that.
Okay, so let's thank our panelists for a terrific